In late March of 1888, when a devastating blizzard swept through Wyoming and claimed lives across 4 counties, there was a widow and 2 children who survived inside the heart of a granite cliff. The neighbors who had called her the mad woman digging holes like a rat would soon kneel at her door, begging to come inside. This is the story of Lorena Haskell, the woman who looked at stone and saw what no one else could see. But to understand that March, you must first understand the September that came before it. You must understand what it means to be a woman alone on land that everyone says cannot sustain life. You must understand what it feels like to watch your husband ride away toward California with another woman's name on his lips, leaving behind nothing but divorce papers and 160 acres of rock and wind. Lorena Haskell stood in the doorway of her cabin on a September morning in 1887, watching the sun rise over the Elkhorn Valley. She was 32 years old. Her hands were calloused from 2 years of work that should have broken her. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned, in the fashion she had learned as a girl in Cornwall, now hung in a simple braid down her back. There was no one to dress for anymore. There was no one to impress. Behind her, in the single room that served as kitchen and bedroom and everything else, her children were still sleeping. Tobias, whom everyone called Toby, was 8 years old and had taken on the work of a grown man without complaint. Evangeline, whom everyone called Evie, was 5 and still asked when her father was coming home. Lorena had stopped answering that question months ago. The silence was kinder than the truth. The cabin was 12 feet by 14 feet. Lorena's husband Garrett had built it in 1882, the year they arrived from the east, and he had built it poorly. The chinking between the logs had cracked and fallen away in places. The roof leaked when it rained and sagged under the weight of snow. The single window faced north, which meant the cabin was dark most of the day and freezing all winter long. Garrett had promised to build a proper house once the land started producing, but the land never produced, and then Garrett was gone. The land, 160 acres of what the Homestead Office had called agricultural potential, and what everyone in the Elkhorn Valley called the Haskell Rock Pile. The soil was thin where it existed at all, stretched over granite bedrock like skin over bone. The growing season was short. The winters were long. In 2 years of trying, Lorena had managed to grow enough vegetables to supplement their diet, but never enough to sell. The oat field that Garrett had planted the first year had yielded so poorly that they had fed most of it to the horse, and the horse had died anyway. What kept them alive was not farming. It was the small income from trapping that Lorena had taught herself, the few dollars she earned selling cured hides to the trading post at Millbrook, 15 miles south. It was the vegetables she grew and preserved. It was the stubborn refusal to admit that everyone else was right, that the land was worthless, that she should sell what she could and move to town and take in washing like a proper widow. Lorena Haskell had not come to Wyoming to take in washing. At her feet, a dog stirred and pressed his nose against her ankle. Russet was a border collie with fur the color of autumn leaves, and Lorena had found him tied to a fence post at an abandoned homestead the previous spring. Someone had left him there to die, and he had nearly obliged them. When Lorena cut him loose, he had been too weak to stand. She had carried him home over her shoulder like a sack of flour, and Toby had fed him broth with a spoon for 3 days until he could eat on his own. Now Russet followed her everywhere. He slept at the foot of her bed. He sat beside her when she worked. He watched the tree line with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time since Garrett left, that she was not entirely alone in the world. She reached down and scratched behind his ears. The nearest neighbours were the Mercer family, 3 miles to the south, on better ground with deeper soil. Declan Mercer had been farming the Elkhorn Valley for 20 years, and he had opinions about everything, including the foolishness of a woman trying to work a homestead alone. His wife, Opaline, was the valley's most reliable source of news and gossip, which meant that everything Lorena did or failed to do was known throughout the county within a week. Farther south, on the best land in the valley, was the Crenshaw spread. Harmon Crenshaw had arrived in Wyoming in 1862 and had built an empire of cattle and wheat over the following 25 years. He sat on the county board. He had the ear of the territorial representative. When Harmon Crenshaw spoke, people in the Elkhorn Valley listened. Lorena had met him only twice, both times at the general store in Millbrook. He had looked at her the way men looked at things they were calculating the value of, and she had not liked it. There was also the Reverend Josiah Blackwell, who presided over the Methodist Church in Millbrook and who had made it clear, in the gentle but persistent way of ministers, that he did not approve of a woman living alone with children on remote land. He spoke often of the dangers. He spoke of the impropriety. He spoke of the Christian duty of the community to provide for widows and orphans, by which he meant that Lorena should sell her land and move to town where she could be properly supervised. Lorena had not sold her land, she had not moved to town. She had instead spent 2 years learning how to survive on ground that everyone said could not support life. And she had done it because of a voice in her memory, the voice of her grandfather, who had taught her things that no one in the Elkhorn Valley knew or would have believed if she told them. Phineas Trelaw had been a tin miner in Cornwall, England, for 50 years. He had gone into the earth as a boy of 14, and had not stopped going until his lungs gave out when Lorena was 16. In those years he had learned things about stone and water and the hidden warmth of the earth that most people would never learn in a lifetime. He had taught those things to Lorena because she was the only one who had asked. The earth keeps secrets, he had told her once, sitting beside her on a stone wall overlooking the grey Cornish sea. But she tells them to those who listen. Lorena had listened. She had listened when he told her about the fogu, the ancient underground chambers that the old Cornish people had built into hillsides, chambers that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer because the earth itself was a blanket. She had listened when he told her about the hot springs that ran through certain kinds of rock, water heated by the deep fires of the world, water that could sustain life in places where life had no business surviving. Granite holds heat, he had said. Find a warm spring in granite and you have found a place to live through anything. She had written his words in a notebook, and she had kept that notebook through her marriage and her immigration and her husband's abandonment. It sat now on the shelf above her bed, its leather cover cracked and worn, its pages filled with her grandfather's wisdom in her own careful handwriting. She had not yet found a use for most of it, but she had not stopped looking. The morning of October 15, 1887, began like any other morning. Lorena rose before dawn to start the fire in the cook stove. She made porridge with the last of the oats and a precious bit of molasses she had been saving. She woke the children and fed them and sent Toby out to check the trap lines while she helped Evie dress. Evie was small for her age and prone to coughs that lingered. The coming winter worried Lorena more than she let anyone see. The cabin was cold even now in October. By January, it would be a choice between freezing in their beds or burning through firewood faster than Toby could cut it. She tried not to think about January. After breakfast, she set Evie to sorting dried beans while she went out to find Toby. The boy had been gone longer than usual, and Lorena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever one of her children was out of sight. It was foolish, she knew. Toby was responsible and careful and knew the land as well as she did, but she had learned in the 2 years since Garrett left that the world took things from you without warning. She had learned not to trust that what was there in the morning would still be there by nightfall. She found Toby at the eastern edge of their property, where the ground rose sharply and the granite bedrock pushed through the thin soil like bones through skin. He was standing with his ear pressed against the rock face, his eyes closed, his small face arranged in an expression of intense concentration. Russet sat beside him, watching the cliff as if he expected it to do something. Lorena called out to her son and asked what he was doing. The boy opened his eyes and turned to her. He had Garrett's dark hair and Lorena's grey eyes, and he looked at her now with an expression she did not recognize. "Mama," he said, "I hear water." Lorena felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she could not have named. She walked to where her son stood and put her own hand against the stone. It was granite, the same granite that made up the ridge and the bedrock, and the reason their soil was so thin. It should have been cold to the touch. It was not cold. A breath of air was coming from somewhere, seeping through a vertical crack in the rock face that she had walked past 100 times without seeing. The crack was narrow, perhaps 18 inches wide at its widest point, and it ran from just above the ground to well over her head. The air coming through it was warm and damp, and it carried a smell that Lorena recognized immediately. Minerals, sulfur, the smell of water that has been heated by the earth itself. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm flat against the stone beside the crack. She thought of her grandfather sitting on that stone wall in Cornwall, the wind off the sea lifting his white hair, his voice patient and certain as he told her things that no one else thought worth knowing. Granite holds heat. Find a warm spring in granite, and you have found a place to live through anything. She opened her eyes and looked at her son. "I need you to stay here," she said. "If I am not back in an hour, go to the cabin and wait for me there. Do not come in after me." The boy's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He understood responsibility in a way that children should not have to understand it. Lorena went back to the cabin and retrieved the lantern, a length of rope, and the hunting knife she kept under her pillow. She told Evie to stay inside with the beans and not to open the door for anyone. Then she returned to the crack in the granite. She had to turn sideways to fit through. The stone pressed against her chest and her back, cold and unyielding, and for a moment she felt a flicker of panic. The passage was dark beyond the reach of a daylight, and narrow, and she could not see where it led. If it dead-ended, she would have to back out. If it collapsed, she would die in the darkness, and her children would become orphans. But the air coming from the depths was warm. And Lorena had learned, in her years on this land, to trust the small signs that others overlooked. She lit the lantern and began to move forward. The passage ran roughly straight for perhaps 40 feet. Lorena counted her steps and marked the walls with her knife as she went, scratching shallow lines in the stone so she could find her way back. The ceiling was low in places, forcing her to duck, and the floor was uneven with loose stones that threatened to turn her ankle. But the passage did not dead-end. It did not collapse. After 20 feet, it began to widen. After 30 feet, she could walk without turning sideways. After 40 feet, she rounded a slight bend to the left and stopped. The lantern light fell on a space that took her breath away. She was standing at the edge of a natural chamber, perhaps 30 feet across, at its widest point and 15 to 20 feet high, at the apex of the ceiling. The ceiling was not solid stone, but a series of fractured granite slabs that leaned against each other at angles, creating gaps through which daylight filtered down in thin, bright columns. The light caught the moisture in the air and gave the whole space a quality of illumination that was like nothing Lorena had ever seen. Along the eastern wall, water wept from a horizontal crack in the rock. It ran in a thin, bright ribbon down to a natural stone lip and pooled in a basin perhaps 2 feet across before finding its way through a crack in the floor. Lorena walked to the seep and put her fingers in the water. It was warm, not hot, but warm as a summer creek, and it was October. The floor of the chamber was uneven granite with several shallow depressions and one long flat stretch that might, with work, accommodate bedrolls for 3 people. Along the northern wall, the rock had been shaped by water and time into a series of deep ledges, natural shelves that ranged from 18 inches to 3 feet deep. And along the base of the eastern wall, near the seep, Lorena saw something that made her kneel down and touch the stone with trembling fingers, a patch of green. A low mat of some small leafed plant that had no business surviving this far from sunlight, fed by the mineral water and the warmth rising from the earth itself. She knelt there for a long time, her hand resting on the green growing thing, her mind turning over the implications of what she had found. She thought of the cabin, with its gaps and its draughts and its single, small window facing north. She thought of Evie's cough and the coming winter, and the way the firewood never seemed to last. She thought of her grandfather's voice. Find a warm spring in granite, and you have found a place to live through anything. When she finally stood and made her way back through the passage, Toby was waiting exactly where she had left him, his face taut with worry that he was trying to hide. Russet sat beside him, tail wagging uncertainly. "Mama," Toby said, "what did you find?" Lorena looked at her son. She looked at the crack in the granite, the narrow door to a chamber that could change everything. She thought of all the people in the valley who would call her mad if she told them what she was thinking. She smiled. "I found a place to live," she said. The work began the following Monday. Lorena was not a woman to let wonder sit idle when there was still good daylight and work to be done. She had spent Sunday reading through her grandfather's notebook, studying his drawings of the Cornish fogu, the ancient underground chambers that had sheltered people for thousands of years. She had made calculations. She had made lists. She had looked at her 2 children sleeping in the drafty cabin and had felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The first task was light. Phineas Treelaw had written extensively about ventilation in underground spaces, about the need for fresh air, and the dangers of bad air collecting in places without circulation. He had also written about light, about the way the ancient builders had created shafts and channels to bring daylight into their chambers without compromising their warmth. Lorena spent 2 days outside on the upper surface of the granite formation, examining the fissures through which light was already filtering into the chamber below. She identified 2 that could be widened without compromising the structural integrity of the stone around them. Then she went to work with a cold chisel and a hammer. She worked carefully, a 1/4 inch at a time. After each series of strikes, she would go down into the chamber and examine the ceiling by lantern light, looking for cracks or signs of weakness. The granite was hard and took the punishment well. By the end of the second day, the light coming through the widened fissures was enough to read by 2 clean columns of illumination that fell to the chamber floor and moved across the stone as the sun moved overhead. Toby helped when she would let him, which was not often. The work on the fissures was too dangerous for a child, so she gave him other tasks, gathering the firewood they would need, checking the trap lines, watching over Evie. At night, the three of them slept in the cabin as they always had, but Lorena found herself lying awake in the darkness, thinking about the warm stone and the sound of the seep and the green growing thing along the eastern wall. The second task was water. The seep along the eastern wall was reliable but uncontrolled. The water ran where it wanted, pooling in some places and draining away in others, and most of it was lost through the crack in the floor before it could be useful. Lorena spent 3 mornings working with a tin cup, and flat stones and river clay she hauled through the passage in buckets, redirecting the water's path, building up small levees, channeling the flow into a controlled stream that ran along the wall and pooled in a natural basin. By the 3rd day, she had a pool that was 8 inches deep and held its level. The water was warm and clean enough for washing, and it did not freeze even when the temperature outside dropped below 20 degrees. The 3rd task was storage. The natural shelves along the northern wall were promising but uneven. Lorena built frames from pine she had cut weeks earlier and carried through the passage in sections. She notched the frames to sit level on the irregular stone and lined 3 shelves with split pine planks. The result was rough but solid. By the end of October, she had root vegetables, dried herbs, 2 crocks of preserved beans, and her full winter supply of dried meat stored on those shelves, out of the weather and the reach of animals for the first time since she had come to this land. The 4th task was sleeping. Against the western curve of the chamber wall, where the warmth of the stone was most constant, she built a platform of planks on low pine legs to keep the bedding off the stone. She stitched a curtain of heavy wool from a blanket that had worn threadbare on one side and hung it on a rod of bent wire, so the sleeping nook was enclosed. She put their second-best quilts on the platform and a folded sheepskin for Evie, who felt the cold more than the others. The first night they slept inside the chamber. Evie was asleep before Lorena had finished trimming the lantern. The child had not coughed once. Lorena lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of the seep, which was very small and continuous, like rain without any of the trouble rain usually brought. Toby lay on his back with his hands behind his head. "It is warm," he said quietly. "I know, it is warm and we did not burn any wood. I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Mama, do you think anybody else has a place like this?" Lorena thought about the question. She thought about the cabin with its gaps and its cold and its single window facing north. She thought about the Mercer cabin 3 miles south, which was larger but not much warmer. She thought about all the homesteads scattered across the Elkhorn Valley, all the families who would spend the coming winter feeding their stoves and watching their firewood dwindle and praying that the cold snaps would not last too long. "No," she said, "I do not believe they do." Toby turned on his side to face her in the darkness. "Then we should not tell anyone," he said. "They would want it for themselves." Lorena felt a complicated pride in her son's thinking and a sadness at the fact that he had learned to think it. 8 years old, and he already understood that people would take from you if you let them. "We will see," she said. "For now, we work. We get ready for winter. We see how the chamber holds up. And then we will know what we have, and we can decide what to do about it. Here is a good place to pause for just a moment." Lorena stood in that chamber, watching the lantern light play across the stone walls her grandfather had taught her to understand. She could hear her children breathing in their sleep, peaceful for the first time in months. She could feel the warmth of the earth around her, steady and sure. But she also knew that nothing stayed secret for long in a small valley. Word would get out. People would come looking. Some would laugh. Some would shake their heads at the foolishness of a woman alone. And some perhaps would want what she had found. What would you do if you were Lorena? Would you hide what you had found and hope no one noticed? Would you invite everyone to see and trust in their goodwill? Or would you do what she did, which was to keep working, keep building, and let the results speak for themselves? Think about that for a moment, and then we will continue. The November wind that came through the Elkhorn Valley was the kind that found every gap in every cabin and made the stove pans rattle on their hooks all night. It was the kind of wind that farmers watched with tight faces, calculating how much firewood they had cut and how much they would need and whether the numbers would meet in the middle. Lorena barely noticed it. She was in the chamber working on the preparation shelf she had decided to build in the widened section of the passage. A plank surface at working height where she could sort and prepare food before carrying it out to the cooking fire. She did not want to cook inside the chamber itself. The smoke would collect in the ceiling despite the improved ventilation, and over time it would cause problems. But the passage was broad enough here for a work surface, and the stone on either side would hold hooks for her knives and towels. She was hanging the second hook when Russet's ears pricked up, and he turned toward the passage entrance, a low growl forming in his throat. A moment later, Lorena heard footsteps. She set down her hammer and waited. There was only one entrance to the chamber, and she was between it and her children. Russet positioned himself beside her, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the opening. The footsteps came closer. Then a voice. "Lorena! Lorena Haskell! Are you in there?" It was Declan Mercer. Lorena let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She walked up the passage to the entrance and emerged into the grey November light, Russet at her heels. Declan was standing about 10 feet from the crack in the granite, his hat in his hands, his expression caught somewhere between concern and confusion. He was a solid man in his mid-40s, with a weathered face and hands that had done 40 years of hard work. He had been kind enough when Garrett left, offering to buy the Haskell land at a fair price, and he had seemed genuinely puzzled when Lorena refused. "Mrs. Haskell," he said, his eyes moving from her face to the crack in the rock and back again, "I came to check on you. The Spence boy said he saw you carrying wood up here yesterday, and Opaline was worried that maybe you had taken to living in a cave." "Like some kind of animal," she said. Her words, not mine. Lorena felt a flash of anger and pushed it down. She had known this moment would come. She had hoped it would come later, after the chamber was finished, after winter had proven what the space could do. But secrets did not keep in small valleys. They never had. "Would you like to see?" she asked. Declan looked at the crack in the granite. His expression suggested that he would very much not like to see, that the idea of going into the rock made him deeply uncomfortable. But he was a man who prided himself on facing things directly, and turning around now would mean admitting to a fear he would rather not acknowledge. "I suppose I would," he said. Lorena led him through the passage, moving slowly so he could follow the path she had cleared. She heard his breath catch when the walls pressed close, heard the small sounds of discomfort he made when his shoulders scraped the stone. But he kept coming. When they emerged into the chamber, Declan Mercer stopped in his tracks. He stood at the edge of the space with his mouth slightly open, his eyes moving from the columns of light falling from the ceiling to the seep along the eastern wall, to the shelves full of preserved food, to the sleeping nook with its wool curtain. He looked at the green growing thing near the water. He looked at the basin where the warm spring collected. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Lorena waited. Declan turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "How warm is it in here?" "About 52 degrees, Lorena said. "It stays steady. The stone holds the temperature." 52? Declan shook his head slowly. "It is 31 outside, maybe 30. "I know, and the water, that water is warm?" "It is." Declan walked to the seep and put his hand in the basin. His eyebrows rose. He pulled his hand out and looked at it as if expecting to see something miraculous written on his palm. "How long have you known about this?" "Since October." "My son found it." Declan looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he looked around the chamber again, and when his eyes came back to her, something in them had changed. "Mrs. Haskell," he said slowly, "I have lived in this valley for 20 years. I have seen every cave and overhang and rock shelter between here and Millbrook. I have never seen anything like this." "No," Lorena agreed. "I do not imagine you have. Does anyone else know? Just my children and me, and now you." Declan was quiet for a moment. "Opaline is going to tell everyone in the county that you have gone crazy and started living in a hole in the ground." "I expect she will. They are going to come look. They are going to want to see." "I expect they will." Declan studied her face. "You are not worried?" Lorena thought about the question. She thought about the work she had done and the work that remained. She thought about the coming winter and the warmth of the stone around her and the sound of the seep that ran day and night without ceasing. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "my husband left me with 2 children and a piece of land that everyone said was worthless. I have spent 2 years proving that everyone was wrong. If people want to come look at what I have built, let them look. I am not ashamed of anything I have done here." Declan nodded slowly. Then his expression shifted to something more serious. "What about Harmon Crenshaw?" The name sent a small chill through Lorena despite the warmth of the chamber. "What about him? He has been interested in this ridgeline for years. There was talk, back when you and your husband first arrived, that he wanted to buy your land, something about mineral rights." Lorena felt the chill deepen. "My husband never mentioned that. Your husband probably did not think it mattered. The land agent in Millbrook told him there was nothing here but rock and wind. But Crenshaw knows rock better than most. And he knows that sometimes what looks worthless on the surface has value underneath. This is not a mine, Mr. Mercer. There is no ore here, just stone and water. I understand that, but Crenshaw might see it differently." Declan paused. "I would be careful if I were you. Crenshaw is a patient man, and he has ways of getting what he wants." The news spread through the Elkhorn Valley exactly as Lorena had expected. Opaline Mercer told her sister-in-law, who told the women at the church sewing circle, who told their husbands, who told the men at the trading post in Millbrook. By the end of November, there was not a person in the county who had not heard some version of the story. The versions varied. Some said Lorena Haskell had lost her mind from grief and loneliness and had started digging her own grave in the granite cliff. Others said she had found an abandoned mine and was living in it like a savage. A few, more sympathetic, suggested that she was simply a desperate woman doing desperate things, and someone really ought to ride up there and bring her and her children to safety before winter set in and it was too late. The visitors began arriving in early December. First came Virgil Spence, a young man of 22 who worked as a hand on the Crenshaw spread and who fancied himself a wit. He rode up to the Haskell claim on a Tuesday afternoon with two of his friends, all three of them grinning in a way that told Lorena they had not come to help. "We heard you were building yourself a grave before you were even dead," Virgil called out as he dismounted. "Thought we would come see the show." Lorena was outside the cabin, splitting wood. She did not stop working. "The entrance is around the east side of the ridge," she said. "You are welcome to look. Watch your step in the passage." Virgil's grin faltered slightly. He had expected anger, maybe, or tears, or at least some attempt to explain herself. He had not expected to be invited in. "You are not going to show us?" "I have work to do, Mr. Spence. You seem capable of finding your own way." The three young men exchanged glances. Then Virgil shrugged and led the way around the ridge to the crack in the granite. Lorena heard their voices as they entered the passage, heard the jokes and the laughter, heard the sound of their footsteps echoing on stone. Then silence. A long silence. When they emerged 15 minutes later, they were not laughing anymore. Virgil's face had a strange expression on it, something that might have been wonder if it had not been fighting so hard against the need to maintain his earlier mockery. "Well," he said, mounting his horse, "it is warm in there, I will give you that. But you will never survive a real cold snap in a hole in the ground. The stone will freeze through." "We will see," Lorena said. "You will indeed." Virgil tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I will give you $5 that you come crawling to town before January, begging for a proper roof over your head. I do not gamble, Mr. Spence. Then I will make the bet with myself." He grinned again, but there was something uncertain in it now. "Have a good winter, Mrs. Haskell." The Reverend Josiah Blackwell came the following day, riding a grey mare and wearing his second-best coat, the one he reserved for visits to the sick and the wayward. "Mrs. Haskell," he said, dismounting with careful dignity, "I have heard some disturbing reports. I imagine you have, Reverend. Reports that you have taken to living in a cave, that you are raising your children in conditions that no Christian woman should accept." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The church has resources for women in your situation. There is no shame in accepting help. I appreciate that, Reverend. But I do not need help." The minister's face tightened slightly. "I have also heard that your methods are based on knowledge from your family in England. From Cornwall, that is correct." "Cornwall." He said the word carefully as if testing it. "The Cornish have certain traditions that are not always consistent with Christian teaching. Pagan traditions, some might say." Lorena felt her temper rise and held it in check. "My grandfather was a tin miner, Reverend. He spent 50 years underground. He knew things about stone and water and warmth that most people never learn. He was also a faithful member of his church until the day he died." "I meant no offense, none taken. Would you like to see the chamber?" The Reverend Blackwell looked at the crack in the granite with visible distaste. "I think not," he said. "My purpose here today is pastoral. I am concerned for your welfare and for the souls of your children. I urge you to reconsider this course of action before it is too late." "Too late for what, Reverend?" But he was already mounting his horse, already turning away, and he did not answer. The third visitor was the one Lorena had been dreading. Harmon Crenshaw rode up to the Haskell claim on a cold, clear afternoon in mid-December, alone. He sat on a black horse that was worth more than everything Lorena owned, and he wore a coat that had been tailored in Cheyenne, or maybe Denver, and he looked at the ridge and the crack in the granite with an expression that revealed nothing at all. "Mrs. Haskell," he said, not dismounting, "I have heard interesting things about your property. Have you, Mr. Crenshaw?" "A warm chamber in the rock, a spring that runs year-round." "Quite remarkable, if the stories are true." "They are true." Crenshaw nodded slowly. "I would be curious to see it." "The entrance is around the east side. You are welcome to look." But he did not move toward the entrance. He sat on his horse, looking at the ridge, and Lorena realized that he was calculating. He was measuring something she could not see. "I have been interested in this ridgeline for some time," he said, "since before you and your husband arrived. There was some thought that it might contain mineral deposits, iron, perhaps, or something more valuable. There is no ore in that rock, Mr. Crenshaw, just granite and water." "So I have heard." He paused. "I have also heard that your claim boundaries may not be entirely clear, the eastern edge in particular. There was some question when your husband filed about whether the rock face was included in the homestead claim or whether it fell outside the boundaries." Lorena felt a cold sensation in her stomach that had nothing to do with the December air. "My claim includes this ridge," she said. "It always has." "Perhaps." Crenshaw smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. "Perhaps not. Boundaries can be complicated things. The land office in Millbrook has records, of course, but records can be incomplete, open to interpretation." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Haskell. I suspect we will be talking again." He turned his horse and rode away. That night, after the children were sleeping peacefully in the chamber, Lorena sat at the small table she had brought into the space and spread out her husband's old land documents in the warm lantern light. She had not looked at them in years. She had not needed to. The land was hers. The claim was filed. What more was there to know? But Crenshaw's words had lodged in her mind like a splinter, and she could not rest until she had examined them from every angle. She found the original survey map from 1881, the year before she and Garrett arrived. She found the homestead filing that Garrett had submitted in 1882. She found the correspondence with the land office, the receipts, the official stamps and signatures. And then she found something else. The eastern boundary of the Haskell claim was described in the filing as running along the base of the granite formation. But when she looked at the survey map, the marker points told a different story. The eastern corner marker was not at the base of the formation. It was at the corner of the formation, at the place where the rock began to rise from the surrounding soil. If the marker was at the corner, then the formation itself was inside the boundary. If the marker was at the base, then the formation might be outside. Lorena looked at the map for a long time. Then she looked at the filing. Then she looked at the map again. Garrett had been careless. Garrett had always been careless. He had set the markers where they seemed convenient and had described them in the filing in language that did not quite match what he had actually done. At the time, it had not mattered. The land was worthless. No one cared about a few feet of granite bedrock. But now, it mattered very much. The formal challenge arrived on December 28, 1887. A young man from the land office in Millbrook rode up to the Haskell claim with an envelope and an apologetic expression. Inside the envelope was a notice informing Lorena that one Harmon Crenshaw had filed for a preliminary mineral survey of the granite formation along the eastern boundary of her property, citing the rock face as potentially mineral-bearing ground and claiming that it fell outside the legal boundaries of the Haskell homestead. The survey would be conducted on March 5, 1888. Until the survey was complete, and the boundaries were officially determined, Lorena was advised to cease any improvements or modifications to the disputed area. She read the notice twice, then a third time. Then she walked to the chamber and stood in the warmth and the light and looked at everything she had built. Cease any improvements. She had a sleeping nook with wool curtains and quilts from Missouri. She had shelves full of preserved food. She had a water system that kept them clean and warm. She had spent 3 months turning a hole in the rock into a home, and now a man who owned half the valley was trying to take it from her because she had something he wanted. Evie was sitting on the sleeping platform, playing with a corn husk doll Lorena had made her. She looked up as Lorena entered. "Mama, what is wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart." "Your face looks wrong." Lorena managed a smile. "Just thinking about something, nothing for you to worry about." But Evie was 5 years old and perceptive in the way of children who have learned to read the moods of adults for their own survival. She watched her mother's face and saw something there that she did not like. "Is someone trying to take our cave?" Lorena knelt beside her daughter and took her hands. "No one is going to take our cave," she said. "I promise you that." January 1888 came to the Elkhorn Valley like a knife. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero on New Year's Day and did not rise above 20 for the rest of the month. The wind that came through the passes was the kind that found every weakness in every structure, that pushed through gaps no wider than a hair, and stole heat faster than any fire could produce it. In the cabin, Lorena and her children would have been miserable. The chinking would have cracked and fallen away. The single window would have frosted over from the inside. They would have huddled around the stove and burned through firewood faster than Toby could cut it, and prayed for the cold snap to break. But they were not in the cabin. They were in the chamber, where the temperature held steady at 52 degrees regardless of what the wind did outside. They were warm and dry and comfortable in a way that Lorena had not been comfortable since leaving Cornwall 15 years earlier. Evie's cough disappeared. Toby slept through the night without shivering. Russet lay on the warm stone floor and dreamed dog dreams, his paws twitching, his tail occasionally wagging at some imagined rabbit or squirrel. And Lorena worked. She could not work on the chamber itself. The land office notice had been clear about that. Any improvements to the disputed area could be used as evidence against her in the boundary determination. So she left the chamber exactly as it was and turned her attention to the paperwork instead. Every night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the small table and spread out her documents in the warm lantern light. The survey map from 1881, the homestead filing from 1882, the correspondence with the land office, and her grandfather's notebook, which she had begun to study with new eyes. Phineas Treloar had been a methodical man. He had recorded everything: measurements, observations, techniques, calculations. He had drawn detailed diagrams of underground spaces and the structures that could be built within them, and he had written, in his precise handwriting, about the legal complexities of mining claims in Cornwall, about boundary disputes and property rights and the ways that powerful men tried to take what did not belong to them. The law is a tool, he had written, like a pickaxe or a shovel. It can be used to build or to tear down. Learn to use it or someone else will use it against you, Lorena learned. She studied the survey map until she could close her eyes and see every line, every marker, every notation. She read the homestead filing until she could recite it from memory. She compared the two, looking for discrepancies, looking for the truth that she knew was there if she could only find it. And on the night of January 15th, she found it. The discrepancy was subtle, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. The homestead filing described the eastern boundary as running along the base of the granite formation. But the survey map showed something different. The eastern corner marker was not at the base of the formation. It was at the corner of the formation, at the point where the rock met the surrounding soil. If you drew a line from that marker to the northern corner marker, the line did not run along the base of the formation. It ran through it. The formation was inside the boundary. The filing was wrong. The map was right. Lorena sat very still for a long time, her finger resting on the corner marker notation, her heart beating hard in her chest. She thought about Garrett, who had set those markers and filed that claim, and never imagined that the difference between base and corner would matter. She thought about the land office clerk who had accepted the filing without checking it against the map. She thought about all the small carelessnesses that added up over time to either disaster or salvation. Then she thought about Harmon Crenshaw, who had read the filing but perhaps had not seen the map, who was basing his claim on words that did not match the reality on the ground. She began to write. The letter she sent to the land office in Millbrook was 4 pages long and included detailed references to both the filing and the survey map. She copied the relevant portions of each document and annotated them with her own measurements, which she had taken by pacing the distance from marker to marker on 3 separate occasions. She requested that the surveyor scheduled for March 5th be provided with the original survey map as well as the filing, so that any discrepancies could be resolved. She sent a second copy of the letter to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, along with a formal request that the boundary determination be made by an independent surveyor rather than someone connected to Harmon Crenshaw or any other interested party. Then she waited. Waiting was the hardest part. January turned to February. The cold eased slightly, then returned with renewed fury in mid-month. Lorena continued to live in the chamber with her children, continued to maintain the systems she had built, continued to preserve food and haul water, and do all the things that keeping a family alive required. But underneath the routine, she was coiled tight with anxiety, waiting for a response that might never come or might come too late. The response came on February 22nd. The letter was from Samuel Carver, the land office clerk in Millbrook, and it was brief and businesslike. He had reviewed her submission and compared the filing with the original survey map. He had found the discrepancy she described. He agreed that the corner marker notation on the map took precedence over the description in the filing, as the map was the primary legal document and the filing was merely a summary. If the surveyor confirmed that the markers were where the map indicated, the granite formation would be determined to lie within the Haskell homestead boundary, and Mr. Crenshaw's claim would be without basis. Lorena read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down on the sleeping platform and cried. She had not cried in 2 years. She had not allowed herself the luxury. There had been too much to do, too many people depending on her, too many reasons to be strong. But now, alone in the warm chamber with her children playing quietly in the sleeping nook and her dog pressed against her side, she let the tears come. She cried for her grandfather, who had given her the knowledge that had made this possible. She cried for her children, who had endured so much without complaint. She cried for herself, for the woman who had refused to give up, even when everyone told her she should. And when she was done crying, she wiped her face and stood up and went back to work. There was still much to do. This is a good place to pause and take a breath. Lorena was facing the hardest moment of her life. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for, was being threatened by a powerful man who wanted what she had. She was alone with 2 children on land that everyone said was worthless. She had no money for lawyers. She had no powerful friends. All she had was her wits and her will and the knowledge that she was right. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Have you ever had someone try to take something from you, something you had earned, something you had built with your own hands? What did you do? What would you do if you were Lorena? Hold on to that feeling, because what happened next would change everything. Harmon Crenshaw heard about the letter the same day Lorena did. He heard because Samuel Carver, though sympathetic to Lorena, was also a careful man who understood the political realities of the Elkhorn Valley. He knew that Crenshaw would learn about the letter eventually, and he preferred to be the one to deliver the news, rather than have Crenshaw hear it second-hand and wonder why he had not been informed. Crenshaw took the news calmly. He thanked Carver for his diligence. He expressed mild surprise that the survey map and the filing did not match. He said nothing about what he intended to do, but that night he rode to the Haskell claim alone. Lorena was in the chamber with the children when she heard Russet growl. It was late, past dark, and no one visited at this hour. She picked up the lantern and walked to the passage entrance, her heart beating hard. Mrs. Haskell. Crenshaw's voice came from outside the crack in the granite. "I would like to speak with you." Lorena stepped out into the cold night air. Crenshaw was standing a few feet from the entrance, his face half lit by the moon, his expression unreadable. "It is late, Mr. Crenshaw." "I know, but I believe we have some things to discuss." He took a step closer. "I have heard about your letter to the land office, about your interpretation of the boundary markers. It is not my interpretation. It is what the survey map shows. Perhaps." Crenshaw's voice was soft, almost friendly. "But you must understand, Mrs. Haskell, that surveys can be interpreted in many ways, and the men who do the interpreting often listen to those who have the means to make their voices heard." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Crenshaw?" "Threatening?" He smiled. "No, I am offering you an opportunity. I am prepared to buy your land at a price well above its market value. You could take your children somewhere warm, somewhere with a proper house and a proper school, and all the things that a woman in your situation should want. And if I refuse?" Crenshaw's smile faded. "Then I suspect the coming months will be very difficult for you. Winter is not over, Mrs. Haskell, and winters in this valley can be long." He turned and walked to his horse. At the edge of the clearing, he paused and looked back. "Think about it," he said. "I am a patient man, but my patience has limits." Then he was gone. Lorena stood in the cold for a long time after he left. Russet pressed against her legs, whining softly. The wind cut through her clothes and found every gap in her defenses, but she did not move. She was thinking about patience, about power, about all the ways that a man like Harmon Crenshaw could make her life difficult if she did not give him what he wanted. And she was thinking about her grandfather, sitting on a stone wall in Cornwall, telling her that the earth keeps secrets but tells them to those who listen. She had listened, she had learned, and she would not be moved. The surveyor arrived on the morning of March 5th, 1888. His name was Anselm Webb, and he was 62 years old, and he had been surveying land in Wyoming Territory for 17 years. He had a weathered face and steady hands, and an expression that suggested he had seen every kind of boundary dispute that human beings could devise, and none of them impressed him much anymore. He came with Samuel Carver from the land office and with a young assistant who carried the instruments. He came early in the morning before Harmon Crenshaw arrived, and he spent the first hour examining the documents that Lorena had assembled. "You have done good work here, Mrs. Haskell," he said, paging through her notes. Most people do not think to compare the filing with the survey map. "I learned to be thorough," Lorena said. "Clearly?" He looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Your grandfather was a miner, you say? Tin mines in Cornwall. 50 years. That explains it." He set down the papers and stood. "Let us go look at your markers." They were examining the eastern corner marker when Harmon Crenshaw arrived. He came with 2 men, a lawyer from Cheyenne in a city coat and polished boots, and a younger man who might have been a clerk or an assistant. They positioned themselves at the boundary line and watched in silence as Webb did his work. Webb ignored them. He set his chains. He read his instruments. He recorded his measurements in a notebook. He walked the boundary line from marker to marker, noting the position of each, comparing what he found with what the map showed. He asked Lorena no questions. He made no comments. He simply measured and recorded and measured again. After 3 hours, he closed his notebook and walked to where Crenshaw was waiting. "Mr. Crenshaw," he said, "I have completed my survey, and the corner markers match the survey map. The formation from corner marker to corner marker is entirely within the filed boundaries of the Haskell homestead claim." He paused. "There is no ground exterior to that claim available for a mineral survey as described in your application. The application is without basis." Silence. Crenshaw's face revealed nothing. The lawyer shifted his weight and looked at his boots. The young assistant glanced from one man to another as if uncertain what was supposed to happen next. "I see," Crenshaw said finally. He turned without another word and walked to his horse. The lawyer and the assistant followed. In less than a minute they were riding away. Webb watched them go. Then he turned to Lorena. "Mrs. Haskell," he said, "I would recommend you file an amended claim that specifically includes the geological formation in the language. Leave no room for future misinterpretation." "I will." "Good." He looked at the crack in the granite, at the narrow entrance to the space that had started all of this. "I would be curious to see what you have built in there. If you are willing, I would be honored to show you." Anselm Webb stood in the chamber for a long time without speaking. He looked at the columns of light falling from the ceiling. He looked at the seep along the eastern wall and the basin where the warm water collected. He looked at the shelves of food and the sleeping nook and the green growing thing that had spread to cover nearly 12 square feet of the eastern wall. "How warm?" he asked. 52 degrees, Lorena said, year-round. "And the water?" "Warm enough to wash in, never freezes." Webb nodded slowly. He walked to the seep and put his hand in the water. He looked up at the fractured ceiling and the light coming through. He looked at everything with the eye of a man who spent his life measuring and evaluating, and when he was done looking, his expression had changed. "Mrs. Haskell," he said, "I have surveyed thousands of acres in this territory. I have seen every kind of claim and every kind of structure. I have never seen anything like this." "My grandfather taught me," Lorena said. "He taught you well." Webb paused. "I should tell you something. Harmon Crenshaw is not a man who gives up easily. Today was a setback for him, not a defeat. He will find another angle, another approach. You should be prepared for that." "I know, do you?" Lorena thought about her grandfather, sitting on a stone wall in Cornwall, telling her things that no one else thought worth knowing. She thought about the 2 years she had spent on this land, refusing to give up, refusing to let others tell her what was possible and what was not. "I know," she said, "but I also know what I have, and I know what it is worth. And I'm not going to let anyone take it from me." Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. No, he said, I do not believe you are. The amended claim was filed on March 12th, 1888. The document specifically included the granite formation on the eastern boundary and all geological features contained therein as part of the Haskell homestead. Samuel Carver processed the paperwork himself and sent Lorena the approved filing within a week. It was done. For the first time since Garrett left, Lorena owned something that no one could take away from her. Not her husband, not her neighbors, not Harmon Crenshaw or any of his lawyers. The land was hers, and the rock was hers, and the chamber within the rock was hers, and no piece of paper or legal maneuvering could change that. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt uneasy. The weather had been strange all month. The temperature rose and fell unpredictably, cycling between thaw and freeze in a way that made the old-timers shake their heads and mutter about what it meant. Old Bertilda Camp, who had lived in the valley longer than anyone, had stopped by the Haskell claim on March 18th and looked at the sky with an expression Lorena did not like. "What do you see?" Lorena asked. "That colour." Bertilda pointed at the horizon, where the sky had taken on a strange yellow-grey tinge. "I saw that colour once before. Winter of 1856. 8 days of snow and 19 dead before it was over. It is almost spring. Weather does not know what month it is, child." Bertilda pulled her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. "You have got that warm place in the rock. Good. You stay in it when the wind turns. And if anyone comes knocking, you let them in. Understand?" "I understand." "Good." Bertilda looked at the sky once more. "I am too old to worry about things I cannot change, but I wanted to warn you because you have got those children to think about, and children deserve a fighting chance." The morning of March 24th, 1888, began like any other morning. Lorena rose before dawn and built a fire in the small stove at the entrance to the passage where she cooked their meals. She made porridge and salt pork and coffee from the last of her beans. She fed the children and sent Toby out to check on the few traps that were still set. The temperature was 42 degrees, warm for late March in Wyoming. The snow that had accumulated over the winter was beginning to melt. The sun rose over the eastern ridge and cast long shadows across the valley, and for a moment, standing in the entrance to the passage, Lorena allowed herself to believe that spring was coming and the worst was behind them. Then she looked at the sky. The yellow-grey colour that Bertilde had pointed out was back, but darker now, more ominous. The clouds were building over the mountains to the north, not the fluffy white clouds of a spring storm, but something dense and angry-looking. The air had a strange quality to it, a stillness that felt like holding breath. Russet was pacing. He had been restless since the night before, unable to settle, whining at sounds Lorena could not hear. Now he stood at the edge of the clearing and stared at the northern horizon, his ears flat against his head, his tail tucked between his legs. Lorena called for Toby to come back. Now, the boy emerged from the tree line with an empty trap in his hand. "Nothing in the lines," he said. "I think the animals have gone to ground. They know something." "What?" Lorena looked at the sky again. The clouds were moving now, faster than clouds should move, rolling over the mountains like a wave. "Get your sister. We are going inside." The storm hit at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It came not with a gradual building of wind and snow, but with a sudden violent assault that took even Lorena by surprise. One moment, the air was still and heavy with waiting. The next moment, the world was white. The wind that came through the valley was not like any wind Lorena had experienced before. It was a solid thing, a wall of force that knocked her backward when she stepped to the passage entrance to look. The snow did not fall from above. It flew sideways, driven by gusts that screamed through the gaps in the rocks like something alive and angry. Lorena pulled the heavy cloth she had hung across the passage entrance and weighted it down with stones. Even so, the wind found its way through, whistling and moaning in the narrow space. Inside the chamber, everything was calm. The temperature held steady. The light from the ceiling fissures was dimmed by the snow above, but the lantern cast a warm glow across the stone. The seep continued its quiet trickle into the basin. The green growing thing along the eastern wall was as alive as ever. Toby sat with his back against the sleeping platform, a book in his hands. Evie was curled beside him, playing with her corn-husk doll. Russet lay at Lorena's feet, still anxious, but calmer now that they were all together in the warmth. "How long will it last?" Toby asked. "I do not know. It sounds angry. It does. But we are safe here." Lorena looked at her son, at his serious face and his grandfather's eyes, at the child who had become a man too early and never complained. "Yes," she said, "we are safe here." The first day passed slowly. The storm did not ease. If anything, it intensified, the wind rising from a scream to a shriek, and then to something beyond description, a sound that vibrated in the bones and made thought difficult. The temperature outside dropped steadily, 20 degrees, then 10, then 0, then far below. In the chamber, nothing changed. Lorena kept the children busy with small tasks, reading, organizing the supply shelves, tending the fire at the passage entrance that kept the air fresh. She made meals from the preserved food on the shelves. She told stories that her grandfather had told her, stories of the old Cornish miners and the things they had learned to survive in the dark places of the earth. When night fell, they could not tell the difference except by the clock. The wind continued, the snow continued. The sound of it was like being inside a drum while someone beat on the outside without stopping. Evie could not sleep. She lay in the warmth of the sleeping nook with her eyes wide open, flinching at every gust. "Mama," she whispered, "is the cabin still there?" Lorena had wondered the same thing. The cabin had been old and poorly built even before Garrett left. A storm like this could tear it apart. "I do not know, sweetheart. If the cabin is gone, where will we live?" Lorena looked around the chamber, at the warm stone walls and the light from above, at the shelves of food and the basin of warm water, at everything she had built over the past 6 months. "Here," she said, "we will live here." The second day, someone came. Lorena heard it first as a sound beneath the wind, a thumping that was not part of the storm's rhythm. Russet heard it too and stood, his ears pricked, a low growl forming in his throat. Then a voice, barely audible. "Hello? Is anyone there?" "Hello?" Lorena moved to the passage entrance and pulled aside the weighted cloth. The wind hit her like a physical blow, driving ice crystals into her face. She squinted against the white blindness and saw, barely visible through the snow, a figure huddled at the entrance to the crack. "Who is there?" The wind swallowed the rest of the words, but then the figure moved closer, and Lorena recognized the shape of him. Declan Mercer. His face was white with ice. His eyebrows and beard were frozen. His coat was crusted with snow that had compacted into something like armor. He was shaking so violently that he could barely speak. "Please," he managed. "My house. Collapsed. Opaline and the children?" Lorena did not hesitate. "Come inside," she said. And she reached out and took his arm and pulled him into the passage. It took him a long moment to understand what had happened. He stood in the passage, still shaking, looking around as if he had stumbled into a dream. The warmth of the stone closed around him. Steam rose from his frozen clothing. Ice crystals in his beard began to melt and drip. "My God," he whispered. "Your family," Lorena said. "Where are they?" "Coming. Behind me. I came ahead to—" He swallowed hard. "I did not know if you would let us in. Of course I will let you in. After everything Opaline said. After how we—" "Mr. Mercer." Lorena met his eyes. "Your family is out there in that storm. That is all that matters right now." She moved past him to the entrance and looked out into the white chaos. At first, she saw nothing. Then shapes emerged from the snow, dark spots against the white, moving slowly toward the crack in the granite. Opaline Mercer was carrying their youngest child, 5-year-old Phoebe. Their oldest, Matthias, who was 12, was helping his father's hired hand drag a small sledge with supplies. The hired hand's wife was there too, with their infant wrapped against her chest. 7 people stumbling through a killing storm because the woman they had mocked was the only hope they had. "Come inside," Lorena called. "Quickly, all of you." The third day, the Spences arrived. Virgil Spence, who had bet $5 that Lorena would crawl to town before January, came through the passage with tears frozen on his face. His young wife was with him, 8 months pregnant, unable to walk without help. His mother, widowed 3 years, came behind them, so cold that she could not speak for an hour after arriving. "Our roof went first," Virgil said when he could talk. "Then the north wall. We had no choice. He stopped. "You are welcome here," Lorena said simply. "I know I said things. You were young. You are still young." Lorena looked at his wife, at her swollen belly and her terrified eyes. "Will you help me make a space for her? She needs to be comfortable." Virgil looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and got to work. The 4th day, the Reverend Blackwell arrived. He came alone, his grey mare lost in the storm, his ministerial dignity stripped away by 2 days in the cold. His hands were blackened with frostbite. His nose was white at the tip. He fell to his knees when he entered the chamber, and whether it was from weakness or prayer, Lorena could not tell. "The church," he whispered. "The church is gone. I am sorry. God's house, destroyed by God's weather." He looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much. "And this place stands, this cave, this place they called pagan. This place was built with knowledge, Reverend. Knowledge that my grandfather spent 50 years gathering. There is nothing pagan about survival." He was silent for a long time. Then he bowed his head. "No," he said. "No, there is not." The 5th day, Cressida Crenshaw arrived with her 2 grandchildren. She came at night, guided through the storm by Matthias Mercer, who had volunteered to go out and help anyone else who might be trying to reach them. The children were 6 and 8, Harmon Crenshaw's grandchildren from his eldest son, who had died 3 years earlier. "Harmon sent us," Cressida said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He stayed to protect the livestock. But he knew we needed to come here." Lorena looked at the woman who had secretly encouraged her, who had warned her about her husband's plans. "You are welcome," Lorena said. "Everyone is welcome." On the 6th day, 3 more arrived. Old Bertilda Camp came first, insisting that she had walked the 2 miles from her cabin rather than die alone. Then a young widow named Patience Greer from an outlying farm, carrying her infant son wrapped in every blanket she owned. And finally, 2 travelers from Cheyenne who had been caught on the road when the storm hit, half frozen and barely able to speak. By the end of the 6th day, there were 22 people in the chamber. 22 people who had mocked her or pitied her or tried to take what was hers. 22 people who had been certain that a widow living in a cave was a fool or a madwoman. 22 people who now sat in the warmth of her stone sanctuary while the storm that would have killed them raged outside. Lorena organized them. She assigned sleeping spaces, rotating who got the warmest spots near the seep and who slept farther away. She rationed food, calculating how long their supplies would last, with this many mouths to feed. She set up a system for water distribution and waste disposal. She kept the children occupied with games and stories. She treated frostbite and calmed panic, and settled arguments with the quiet authority of a woman who knew that she was the only thing standing between these people and death. Toby helped. He was only 8, but he moved among the refugees with a confidence that belied his age, bringing water to the thirsty, helping the elderly find comfortable positions, entertaining the younger children with tales of his exploration of the chamber. Evie helped too in her own way. She sat with the frightened children and let them pet Russet and told them that everything would be all right because her mama had built this place and her mama was the smartest person in the world. And Russet, who had once been left to die at an abandoned homestead, lay beside whoever seemed to need him most, offering the simple comfort of warmth and presence. Here is a moment to pause and let the silence settle. 22 people in a chamber that Lorena had built with her own hands. 22 people who had called her crazy, who had laughed at her, who had tried to take what was hers. 22 people who were alive because she had looked at a crack in a rock and seen what no one else could see. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to be vindicated, not by arguing or boasting, but simply by surviving, by doing the work that others said was foolish, and then being proved right in a way that no one could deny. That is what Lorena had done. And now she had to figure out what came next. What would you do? Would you say, "I told you so"? Would you hold grudges against the people who had doubted you? Or would you do what Lorena did? Let us find out. The storm broke on the morning of April 2nd, 1888. Lorena was the first to notice. She had been awake through the night, listening to the sound of the wind, and sometime around dawn the sound changed. The shriek became a moan, then a whisper, then silence. She moved to the passage entrance and pulled aside the cloth. The world outside was white and still. Snow had drifted to the height of a man in some places. The sky above was blue, the first blue it had been in 9 days. The air was bitterly cold but motionless, no longer trying to tear the world apart. Behind her she heard movement as others woke and realized what had happened. She heard gasps and whispers and someone weeping with relief. But Lorena did not weep. She looked at the transformed landscape, at the evidence of destruction that was already visible, a tree stripped bare and broken, the corner of a roof poking through a snowdrift, and she thought about what the next days would bring. Cleanup, rebuilding, the counting of the dead, and questions, so many questions about why some had survived and others had not, about what it meant that the widow with the hole in the rock had been right all along. Mama, Toby was beside her, looking out at the white world. "Is it over?" "The storm is over," Lorena said, "but there is still a lot of work to do." The world outside the chamber was devastated. Lorena walked through it on the afternoon of April 2nd, with Toby beside her and Russet ranging ahead, and what she saw made her heart ache. The Mercer cabin was a pile of rubble, the roof collapsed under the weight of snow, the walls blown outward by the force of wind. The Haskell cabin, her own cabin where she had lived for 2 years, was simply gone, swept away to some other place by the storm's fury. The fences were down, the outbuildings were destroyed, the landscape she had known had been erased and replaced by something alien and cold. But in the midst of the destruction, one thing stood untouched: the granite ridge, the crack in the rock, the chamber within. Lorena stood at the entrance and looked at the devastation around her, and understood, in a way she had not understood before, what her grandfather had given her. Not just knowledge, not just technique. He had given her a way of seeing the world that others had lost or never learned. He had taught her that the earth itself was a shelter if you knew how to use it. And she had used it. And 22 people were alive because of it. The counting of the dead began 2 days later, when the first riders from Millbrook reached the Elkhorn Valley. Many people had died in the storm across the county. Some were caught outside when it hit and froze to death within hours. Some were trapped in collapsed buildings and could not escape. Some were elderly or infirm and succumbed to the cold in inadequate shelter. Some were children. When the riders reached the Haskell claim and found 22 people alive and well in a chamber inside the granite cliff, they did not know what to say. They stood in the passage entrance and looked at the shelves of food and the basin of warm water and the children playing on the stone floor, and they stared as if they had stumbled into a miracle. "How?" one of them asked. "Knowledge," Lorena said. "My grandfather taught me. Knowledge." The man shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Haskell, you have done something remarkable here. People are going to want to know how you did it. Then I will tell them," she told them. In the weeks that followed the storm, Lorena became the most sought-after woman in the Elkhorn Valley. People came from miles away to see the chamber, to hear her explain how she had built it, to understand the principles that had made it possible. She showed them her grandfather's notebook. She explained the way granite holds heat. She demonstrated the ventilation system and the water collection and the natural insulation of stone. She taught anyone who wanted to learn. Declan Mercer was the first to ask. He came to her 3 days after the storm, hat in his hands, a look on his face that she had never seen before. He was a proud man, Declan Mercer, a man who had spent 20 years believing he knew everything worth knowing about this valley. What he had to say did not come easily. "Mrs. Haskell," he said, "I owe you an apology." "You do not owe me anything, Mr. Mercer." "Yes, I do." He took a breath. "I called you crazy. I said you would die in that hole. I let Opaline say things that..." He stopped. "I was wrong. We were all wrong. And if you had not been the kind of person who keeps working, even when everyone tells you to stop, my wife and children would be dead." Lorena looked at him for a long moment. Then she held out her hand. "Help me rebuild," she said. "Learn what I know, pass it on to others. That is the only thanks I want." Declan took her hand and shook it. "I will," he said. Virgil Spence was the next. He came with his wife, who had given birth in the chamber 2 days after the storm broke, a healthy girl they named Stone, for the walls that had protected her. He did not meet Lorena's eyes at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I bet $5 you would fail," he said. "I laughed at you. I called you." He could not finish. "You were young," Lorena said. "That is no excuse." "No, it is not. But you learned?" "You are learning now. That is what matters." Virgil looked at her, then really looked, and what he saw made his eyes fill with tears that he did not try to hide. "You could have left us out there," he said. "After what I said, you could have let us die." "No," Lorena said, "I could not have." "Why not?" She thought about it. She thought about her grandfather, who had helped anyone who asked, and some who did not. She thought about what it meant to have knowledge that could save lives and to choose whether to share it. Because that is not who I am, she said. That is not who I want to be, and that is not who my children are going to see when they look at me. Reverend Blackwell did not apologize with words. He apologized with actions. In the weeks after the storm, he threw himself into the work of rebuilding the valley. He organized work parties. He distributed supplies. He preached sermons about humility and about the dangers of assuming that wisdom could only come through proper channels. I was arrogant, he said in one such sermon, which Lorena attended at his request. I thought I knew where wisdom came from and where it did not. I was wrong. Wisdom comes to those who seek it, whatever their background, whatever their education, whatever their standing in the community. Mrs. Haskell sought wisdom from her grandfather, and that wisdom saved lives. Let that be a lesson to all of us. It was the closest he ever came to a public apology, but from that day forward he treated Lorena with respect, and when people came to the valley asking about the woman who had built a shelter in the rock, he was the first to direct them to her. Harmon Crenshaw never apologized. But something changed in him after the storm. His grandchildren had survived because his wife had brought them to Lorena's chamber. His own arrogance in staying behind to protect the livestock had nearly cost him his family. He had spent 9 days alone in the wreckage of his empire, eating raw horse meat and burning his finest furniture for warmth, while his grandchildren played in the stone sanctuary of the woman he had tried to destroy. When he finally emerged, frostbitten and diminished, he found a valley that no longer looked at him with the same deference. His power had been built on the assumption that he knew best, that his experience and wealth made him wise. But the storm had taught people a different lesson. Harmon Crenshaw's wealth had not saved him. His experience had not helped him. His power had meant nothing when the wind came. It was the widow with the hole in the rock who had saved people. Crenshaw never spoke to Lorena again. He rebuilt his ranch, but he did it quietly, without the swagger of before. He stepped down from the county board. He stopped attending church. He became, in the final years of his life, something he had never been before. Humble. It was not forgiveness, but it was something. Spring came slowly to the Elkhorn Valley in 1888. The snow melted, revealing the extent of the destruction. Cabins were rebuilt, fences were repaired, the dead were buried, and the living got on with the business of living. And Lorena's chamber became a landmark. Families from across the county came to see it. Engineers from Cheyenne came to study it. A professor from the Territorial University came to measure the temperature differential and write about the thermal properties of granite. A newspaper from Denver sent a reporter who wrote a story about the widow of Elkhorn Valley that was reprinted in papers across the territory. Lorena showed them all. She showed them the seep and the shelves and the sleeping nook. She showed them her grandfather's notebook and explained the principles behind each design choice. She drew diagrams on scraps of paper and answered questions and never once made anyone feel foolish for not knowing what she knew. You could charge for this, Declan Mercer told her once. People would pay to learn. My grandfather did not charge, Lorena said. He taught anyone who asked because he believed knowledge was meant to be shared. I will not dishonor his memory by doing different. In the summer of 1888, Lorena expanded the garden along the eastern wall of the chamber. She planted tomatoes, which everyone said would not grow at this altitude. She planted herbs and radishes and lettuce. She used the warm water from the seep to irrigate them and the light from the ceiling fissures to nourish them. By July, she had 12 ripe tomatoes on the vine. Toby counted them himself, standing on a crate to reach the highest, his face split by a grin that Lorena had not seen since before his father left. 12 tomatoes, he said, in a cave in Wyoming. In a chamber, Lorena corrected gently. 12 tomatoes in a chamber in Wyoming. He jumped down from the crate and hugged her. "Mama, you did it. You did what everyone said was impossible." Lorena held her son and looked at her garden and felt something shift in her chest. Pride, yes, but something else too. Something that felt like peace. She had been trying to survive for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to thrive. Now she remembered. The years that followed were good years. Lorena rebuilt a cabin above ground, but she did not live in it except in the mildest months. She lived in the chamber with her children, in the warmth and the light that her grandfather's knowledge had made possible. The cabin became a storeroom and a place to meet visitors, but the chamber was home. In the spring of 1889, Anselm Webb came calling again, not to survey the land this time. He came with flowers and a question and a look in his eyes that Lorena had not seen from any man since Garrett first courted her, back when she was young and did not know how much the world could hurt. "I know I am an old man," Anselm said. "Too old for a woman like you, probably. But I have been thinking about you ever since I did that survey. And then after the storm, when I heard what you did..." He stopped. "Go on," Lorena said. "I have been alone for 15 years. My wife passed, and I never found anyone who made me want to stop being alone. Until I met you." He looked at the flowers in his hands. "I am not asking for anything you do not want to give. I just wanted you to know." Lorena looked at this man who had defended her when no one else would, who had stood in her chamber and seen what she had built and called it remarkable, who was offering her something she had stopped believing she would ever have again. "I will think about it," she said. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she said yes. They married in the summer of 1889 in a small ceremony in the chamber, with the columns of light falling on them like blessings and the sound of the seep providing music that no organ could match. Toby gave his mother away. Evie threw wildflowers. Russet barked at the appropriate moments. And Lorena, for the first time in many years, allowed herself to be happy. The happiness lasted. That was the remarkable thing, the thing that Lorena had not dared to hope for. The happiness lasted. Anselm moved into the chamber with them, and they made it work. They expanded the sleeping area. They built a proper kitchen in the widened part of the passage. They created a study where Anselm could do his survey work and where Lorena could continue her grandfather's research. Toby grew into a young man who knew more about stone and water and underground construction than people twice his age. Evie grew into a young woman who had her mother's grey eyes and her own fierce intelligence. They both attended school in Millbrook when they were old enough for the journey, and they came home each evening to the chamber that had become the most famous dwelling in the territory. Other chambers were built. That was part of the legacy, too. Declan Mercer found a seep in the ridge behind his rebuilt cabin and spent 2 years creating a smaller version of Lorena's chamber. 3 other families did the same. By 1895, there were 6 chamber dwellings in the Elkhorn Valley, all of them built using principles from Phineas Treloar's notebook. The professor from the Territorial University came back several times. He measured temperatures and took notes and eventually wrote about indigenous thermal construction methods and their application to modern settlement in cold climates. He cited Lorena as his primary source and dedicated the work to the wisdom of those who came before. Russet died in the autumn of 1893 at the age of 11 or so. No one knew exactly how old he had been when Lorena found him. He went peacefully in his sleep, lying in his favorite spot near the seep where the stone was warmest. Lorena found him there in the morning, still and quiet, and she knew before she touched him that he was gone. They buried him at the entrance to the passage, in a grave lined with river stones. Toby carved a marker from granite. Russet Haskell, faithful friend, 1882 to 1893. Evie cried for 3 days. Lorena cried too, in private, when no one could see. She had not realized how much she had depended on that dog until he was gone. He had been there through everything, the abandonment, the discovery, the building, the storm, the rebuilding. He had never judged her, never doubted her, never wanted anything from her except food and shelter and the occasional scratch behind the ears. He was a good dog, Anselm said, sitting beside her at the grave. He was the best dog, Lorena said. Old Bertilde Camp passed away in 1896 at the age of 86. She had outlived all her predictions, all her warnings, all the storms she had foreseen. In her final days, she asked to be brought to Lorena's chamber, and they carried her there on a stretcher and set her up in the warmest spot near the seep. I wanted to see it one more time, she said, her voice thin but clear. The thing that should not exist but does. It exists because of people like you, Lorena said, people who remember. No. Bertilde shook her head slightly. It exists because of people like you, people who listen. She reached out and took Lorena's hand. Your grandfather must have been proud of you. I hope so. He was. I know he was. Bertilde closed her eyes. I am going to rest now. Do not you worry about me. I have had a good long life, and I have seen things turn out right in the end. That is all anyone can ask. She died that night, quietly, in her sleep. They buried her in the Millbrook Cemetery, but Lorena felt her presence in the chamber for a long time afterward, in the way the light fell through the fissures and the way the seep sang its quiet song. The years continued to pass. Toby became a surveyor like his stepfather, and then an engineer, and eventually wrote a book about underground construction that was used in universities across the country. He married a teacher from Millbrook and had 3 children, all of whom learned to love the chamber that their grandmother had built. Evie became a doctor, one of the first women doctors in Wyoming, and spent her career helping people who had been told they were beyond help. She never married, but she never seemed to mind. She had her work and her family, and the chamber that was always there when she needed it. Anselm lived until 1910, 21 years after he married Lorena. He died in his sleep, in the bed they shared in the chamber, with Lorena beside him. She held his hand until the warmth left it, and then she sat with him for a long time, remembering. After Anselm was gone, Lorena lived alone in the chamber. But she was never lonely. Her children visited often. Her grandchildren ran through the passages and played by the seep and counted the tomatoes on the vine. The people of the Elkhorn Valley came to her with questions, and she answered them. The curious came from farther away, and she welcomed them too. She became, in her final years, something of a legend. The woman who had looked at stone and seen a home. The woman who had survived when everyone said she would fail. The woman who had taken in the people who had mocked her and saved their lives without asking for anything in return. Lorena Haskell Webb died on a spring morning in 1918 at the age of 63. She died in the chamber that she had built 30 years earlier, in the bed that she had shared with Anselm, in the warmth and the light that her grandfather's knowledge had made possible. Toby was with her at the end, holding her hand, and Evie arrived an hour later, having come as fast as she could from Cheyenne. They buried her beside Russet at the entrance to the passage with a granite marker that Toby carved himself. Lorena Haskell Webb, 1855 to 1918. She looked at stone and saw a home. The chamber still stands. The Wyoming Historical Society took it over in 1945 and restored it to its original condition. Visitors come from all over the country to see it, to walk the passage that Lorena walked, to stand in the space that saved 22 lives, to understand how knowledge passed from one generation to the next can make the difference between death and survival. Phineas Traylor's notebook is displayed in a glass case near the entrance. The pages are brown with age, the handwriting faded but still legible. Visitors lean close to read the words that Lorena read so many times, the wisdom of a Cornish miner who never imagined that his lessons would save lives on the other side of the world. "The earth keeps secrets," he wrote, "but she tells them to those who listen." Lorena listened. And because she listened, because she worked, because she refused to give up, even when everyone told her she was wrong, 22 people survived a storm that killed many others. 6 more chambers were built using her methods. Countless lives were saved by the knowledge that spread from her work. That is her legacy. Not anger at those who doubted her, not bitterness at those who mocked her, just the simple, profound truth that knowledge is meant to be shared, that survival is a community effort, and that the people who look at things twice sometimes see what others miss. On the wall of the chamber, near the seep where the warm water still runs after all these years, there is a phrase carved into the granite. Toby put it there the summer after his mother died, using the same tools she had used to shape the stone. The letters are rough but clear, and they catch the light from the fissures above in a way that makes them seem to glow. The words are from Phineas Traylor's notebook, the same words that Lorena had quoted to her children and her grandchildren and anyone else who asked her what she had learned from everything she had been through. Stone does not speak, but stone teaches. The wise are those who know how to listen. Lorena listened. May we all learn to do the same. This story is a work of fiction inspired by the real survival techniques used by communities throughout history. While the blizzard and the characters are imagined, the principles of underground thermal construction that Lorena used are based on real building methods from Cornwall, Iceland, and other cold climate cultures. And that is the story of Lorena Haskell, a woman who refused to give up, a woman who trusted the knowledge that her grandfather had given her, a woman who looked at a crack in a rock and saw something that no one else could see. 22 people survived because of her. The difference was not luck, it was not chance. It was the simple fact that Lorena had done the work that others had laughed at, and when the moment came, that work saved lives. There is a lesson in that, a lesson about listening to the people who came before us, a lesson about doing the work even when others do not understand, a lesson about who we choose to be when we have the chance to help or the chance to turn away. Lorena chose to help. Every single time she chose to help. If her story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who has been told they are crazy for doing things differently. Share it with someone who has been laughed at for trusting their own knowledge, because the Lorenas of this world are rare, and they deserve to know they are not alone. Thank you for listening. And remember, stone does not speak, but stone teaches. The wise are those who know how to listen. The end.